Thank you so much, Auntie. So as you'll notice, I did just hit the record button. Just so everyone knows, we are going to be recording the speakers today, but you won't be recorded unless you speak. If you ask a question during the Q&A. So if you need us for an alibi, make sure that you ask a question. But if there's somewhere else you're supposed to be right now, like working, and this isn't part of your portfolio, then don't ask because you'll be recorded and we don't want to get you in trouble. So the next thing I am going to do is give a very brief introduction to our panelists today. I'm so grateful to Lorraine and Sam and Rachel for putting this together and also for being so flexible with the scheduling. As some of you know, this was supposed to happen in early December, but we had to change the date. So I'm so grateful that everyone was able to gather together. And in fact, I think we have more folks joining us today than we would have at the end of last year. So that's a really positive sign in terms of what we're talking about. Lorraine Mitro is a member of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation from Old Crow in Yukon, and she's served her community in a number of leadership positions. Sam Hunter is a member of the Weenusk First Nation from Pewanik in Northern Ontario. Sam is the Natural Resources and Community Climate Change Monitor for his community. And Rachel LaFortune is a researcher in the Environmental Division at Human Rights Watch. So as I mentioned, these are very brief introductions of folks who do incredibly important work that not just impacts their communities, but really benefits all of us in Canada and around the world. So I'm really grateful to them for being here. I'm so looking forward to hearing what they have to say. In terms of housekeeping and how we're going to run the Q&A, so Rachel, Lorraine, and Sam are going to talk about the report. They're going to talk about the impact that climate change has had on their communities. And when they're done, we're going to open it up for questions. As I said earlier, we're hoping that we will have lots of you participating in the conversation. So if you have a question, please indicate that in the chat, and then I'll call on you when it's your turn, and you can say your question in your own words, because I'm sure you're all already sick of hearing my Manitoba accent. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and pass it over to Rachel. Merci. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you, Elder Constance, for that wonderful start to our session. And thank you all for being here today. As Amanda said, my name is Rachel. I'm a researcher with the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and I'm honored to be speaking to you all today from the unceded and unsurrendered territories and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And really honored in particular to be speaking alongside Sam and Lorraine, two amazing humans who are the real experts on this. So I will only be speaking briefly to give you all an overview of the report and kind of frame the conversation before handing things over to Lorraine and Sam for you to all hear directly from them how climate change is already impacting their communities and what needs to happen moving forward to address these impacts. So this report, My Fear is Losing Everything, released by Human Rights Watch late last year, is the product of about 2 years of research and work and relationship building, and comes out of work that Human Rights Watch was involved with earlier, which I believe, Amanda, you were also contributed to. You may have seen or may be aware of Human Rights Watch's earlier work on the impacts of drinking water advisories in First Nations in Ontario, carried out by my colleague Amanda a number of years back. And as Amanda was undertaking this research with First Nations in Ontario, in addition to concerns about water, some of what she was hearing of course, was concerns about climate change and how that was impacting communities, and in particular impacting access to food for communities. And so this was sort of the seed of what became a much larger and longer research project, specifically looking at these impacts. And so why Canada, though, and why this particular project? Human Rights Watch is an international human rights organization known for working in, I think it's now over 100 countries worldwide. And probably for many of you more familiar with our work on human rights violations in the context of political crackdowns or attacks on human rights defenders. But we wanted to be doing some work specifically focused on the human rights impacts of climate change as one of the most pressing concerns facing our planet today and in the years to come. And Canada provided an important advocacy target on this front. Canada is a top 10 global greenhouse gas emitter. We actually have some of the highest per capita emissions in the world. And despite that, Canada likes to present itself as a climate leader. And there, along with many other human rights issues, there's a significant gap between the image that Canada presents to the world and, unfortunately, the reality of climate action that is taken. And as we found in conducting this research, First Nations are among those disproportionately exposed to the realities of climate impacts in this country. So what did we find in this research? And speaking to over 100 people through interviews with community members, leaders, scientists and policy advisors and government. Well, Lorraine and Sam will be far better placed than me to tell you specifically, so I won't get into too much details, but just to foreshadow that what you hear from Sam and Lorraine is not unique to their communities. We heard overwhelmingly that First Nations are seeing dramatic climate impacts that have direct implications for their communities' abilities to maintain their cultures, to access the traditional foods that have been the basis of food security for their communities since time immemorial. And in addition to this, are also impacting access to store-bought foods. And so what does this mean exactly? We're talking about permafrost thaw, increased forest fires, decreased snow cover in winter, and many environmental impacts documented by traditional knowledge keepers in communities and by scientists alike that show that the landscape of Canada and the climatic conditions of Canada are changing dramatically. And as a result, species that would normally be available are no longer migrating through certain communities' traditional territories, or animals and plants that used to be present in large numbers are no longer present in those numbers, putting communities in a position of having to rely more on imported store-bought food that is shipped from urban centers in the south of the country, and shipped through incredibly lengthy and complex supply chains, by which point, when especially fresh produce reaches communities, it is often close to expiring or even past its expiration date. And then on top of this, not only is healthy fresh food not easily accessible in good quality in remote communities such as Sam's and Lorraine's, but the prices are astronomical. An average family of four in both Old Crow and Peawanuck would have to spend about half of their income to access the same diet that a family in Whitehorse or Toronto would spend maybe like 20% or less of their monthly household income on. And so this is a significant issue, and one that climate change is exacerbating as traditional foods become less accessible or more dangerous to access because of changing climate conditions. And of course, also shipping costs for store-bought foods are also increasing as a result of climate making supply through winter roads constructed seasonally to certain remote communities over snow and ice, less reliable, and forcing communities to rely on more expensive air transport. And so what does this mean concretely for communities? Well, we documented instances of children going to school hungry, of elders being forced to skip meals, of individuals with particular health needs, individuals who need to eat a medically prescribed diet, not having access to the nutritional values that they need and require, and facing elevated health risks. And a good example of this would be diabetes, which is present in elevated levels in First Nations, largely as a result of the impacts of colonialism and socioeconomic marginalization, and which can be, studies show can be prevented or is less likely in cases where individuals have access to traditional foods. But of course, as that access diminishes and as people are forced to rely more on store-bought foods, likely there's a tie to increased rates of diabetes as well. So all of this is to say that we're looking at impacts not just on access to food, but impacts on health, on mental health, and as I'm sure Sam and Lorraine will talk about impacts on culture, and on being able to spend time on the land, to access traditional foods that are essential to maintaining cultural practices and identity, and a slew of other related impacts. And these impacts are projected to worsen. Canada is warming at 2 times the global rate, and 3 times the global rate across the north. So this is a very pressing concern, and one that should be top priority for the Canadian government at all levels. But unfortunately, government policy at this point has not reflected the urgency of these impacts, particularly in the context of acknowledging that these impacts from climate change are in many respects not new, and to the extent that climate is really an exacerbating factor for health disparities and disproportionate levels of food insecurity in Indigenous communities that already exist across Canada, again, largely as a result of the impacts of colonialism and ongoing marginalization, and discrimination in access to resources. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, Canada, it has a number of human rights obligations as a party to numerous international human rights treaties that enshrine obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including the right to food, culture, and health. And in the context of climate change, there are specific obligations to not only address the impacts that climate change has on these rights, but also to prevent the very foreseeable harm that will result from continued unmitigated climate warming. And I'm happy to speak a bit more about kind of the specifics of what has been done and what hasn't been done, and opportunities for sort of advocacy engagement. But I think first I will hand the mic over to Lorraine, so you can hear from her about how her community is experiencing climate change in Yukon.
Masi, can you hear me okay? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Lorraine. We're all nodding.
Okay, thank you. Shori Lorraine Mitro Valji. Vuntut Gwitchin Gwitsat Ichi. O Pro Yukon Gwitsat Ichi. Juk Drenjat Noa Ichi Enjet Hype Chono Jignu. At the Enjet Chanjo Nelly Constant. The Enjet Gitamin G Enjet Masi Chono Jignu. My name is Lorraine Mitro. I'm from the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation in Old Crow, Yukon. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge our Elder Constance for your opening prayer and your very kind and powerful words to start us off. I want to also acknowledge that I'm on the land, on the traditional territory of Ta'an, Gwitchin, and the Kwanlin First Nation in Whitehorse, Yukon. And just want to also acknowledge the law students that we're speaking to today. And Masik Cho, thank you for this opportunity. And all those who are joining us online, I thank you. And I'm really honored to speak with you today because you are our future leaders. You are our future decision makers. And in your studies in law, you will uphold all the laws for all of our future generations. So you play a very vital and important role for all of us in this country of Canada. And so Masik Cho for that, I'll just give you I'll give you a little bit of history of myself. I was born and raised in Old Crow, Yukon. And Old Crow is the most northern community in the Yukon. We're 112 kilometers inside the Arctic Circle. Me and my 5 sisters was raised out on the land by my late mother, Mary Mitro. And it was at the time when there was no assistance programs for single parents. So my dear mother was both a hunter and a trapper and provided everything for us for our needs and for our way of life. And most of our young life was spent out on the land. And when I say out on the land, we lived in a wall tent, and we made do with everything that is around us. We lived a very simple life, but we also lived a very rich life. I never ever felt in my young age growing up that I wanted anything more. And so I'm sharing this with you just to help build that understanding. My community, the population is less than 300 people. So if you Google a map of the Yukon, you'll see where Old Crow is. And as I was sharing, our traditional and cultural way of life was and still is very strong. We were taught from the time that we were born to be stewards of our lands, of the animals and the waters. And this teaching has been with our people since time immemorial. That teaching has helped sustain the Gwitchin people for our physical, our spiritual, and our emotional needs, so that we will and we can and we continue to survive. Because back then, you know, in these winter months that we're in right now, the weather was very, very cold. You know, in January and in December, in those years, it can get down to -50 with a wind chill, or -60. And still yet our people they dress up warm and they go out and they carry on with their day-to-day life. Our traditional hunting camps of each of our respective families is spread out through our traditional territory. And all of our families gather in those traditional camps every spring and every fall to harvest foods, our traditional foods that we need. The main source of food for us in Old Crow and the Gwitchin people in North Yukon and NWT is the Porcupine Caribou herd. We also rely on the fish and salmon that come up our rivers. If you look at a picture of Old Crow, we're right on the banks of the Porcupine River where it joins up with the Crow River. So these camps that are out on our traditional territory has been passed down from generation to generation of their families. And we feed our families from our ancestral lands and practice our cultural way of life. And we still rely on the caribou, fish, salmon, and other small animals and berries. Every summer we harvest our berries, the blueberries, cranberries, and we call it salmon berries. We hold our lands very sacred, and we still walk to this day on the ancient trails of our ancestors. And I'm really grateful and happy to say that today, my community, we have the best of both worlds. We have a foot planted in our cultural way of life, and also in this, we call it the outside world, the outside society. You cannot get in a car and drive to my community. We are a fly-in community, fly-in only. So there's no other transportation except you go fly by plane. So I want to share with you what we've done in the last 40 years. The last 40 years, our experts who are our hunters and our trappers, they began to notice a change in our landscape. And so they sounded the alarm bells about that. Nobody listened. So still yet today, the landscape is still changing right in front of our eyes. The Porcupine Caribou herd, the main staple of our diet as Gwitchin people, has faced threat of oil and gas development right in their core calving grounds. And that core calving grounds is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And they've been facing this threat for the last 40 years. And right today, the Trump administration has made it one of his promises to allow this oil and gas drilling to happen. So we as the Gwitchin people has been on the front lines of trying to protect Gwitchin. The elders call this place the sacred place where life begins. So that's another threat that we face today. North Yukon is our homeland. And North Yukon is the fastest warming region in the world, which makes it unsafe for trappers and hunters to be out on the land. The snow and ice conditions, is very unpredictable and makes it so unsafe for them to travel, and also for the migratory animals that we rely on for food. The permafrost is melting, at an alarming, drastic rate. The lakes, the rivers are being impacted. You know, over the years, we hear about climate change from this outside world and the impacts that all of our people, the indigenous people of our lands, are facing. And we hear about adaptation to climate change. You know, we've been part of those discussions since it began, offering our traditional knowledge and way of looking forward to addressing these issues. You know, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, there's, you know, in my community, I told you that each family has a traditional camp. Well, in my community, Crow Flats is our hunting and trapping area for many families. Every spring, our families go out there to trap. You know, this family, they go to this one area since time immemorial. And about 5 years ago, because of climate change and permafrost melting and the erosion of our lands, that lake completely drained. It just left a big imprint of where the lake used to be. And that lake and that place holds memories and teachings of that family. And can you just imagine for 1 minute the devastation that they felt? Gone. You can rebuild that. How can you ask a people to adapt to that? And that's happening more and more with the lakes and rivers. The cabins and the camp areas are having to be moved by the families further and further back from their original camp areas. And the shrub growth is absolutely extreme. You know, we go out and the hunters and trappers have seen this over the years, but you know, the shrub is covering all of our areas at an alarming rate, and it's impacting the migratory routes of our animals and the ancient trails of our people. The waters in our rivers are warming up. We've had the worst ever salmon run this past year. We were really blessed and really so very grateful that the caribou came back this past year. So we do have our food supply. But in years past, we've faced extreme food insecurity. And we have to rely on our local co-op store to provide for us our food source. And we want our families and our children, our grandchildren to be healthy, just like everybody else. So if I want to feed my grandchildren fruits and vegetables and I have to buy meat from our local co-op store, I have to pay $7 for 3 bananas or $7 for 3 oranges. And the high rate of food costs in my community is extreme. And so that gives you a little bit of understanding of what we face in my community. And moving forward, you know, we have, thank God, we have resilient, forward-thinking young leaders who have come up with solutions so that we can move forward. We have a solar project that will be completed within the next year and a half. We have a project that's, you know, measuring the winds and the weather up on Crow Mountain. And we also have a researcher that's in my community now that's gathering information and confirming all these issues that we face in my community. And that's one thing that, you know, that I want to say is that, you know, we've been saying climate change impacts our people and our community and our way of life for the past 20 years now, but it had to be confirmed. It had to be confirmed. The voice of our trappers and our experts, our trappers, hunters and trappers, was not good enough. And so as we move forward, you know, as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, the decisions that we make today affect 7 generations and more from now. And so we are all responsible on how we move forward. And we'll be at that table. Our voice is important for those little ones who are in our community right now. We face extremely uncertain times with climate change. You know, and you just have to look at our history. When I say we'll be at that table, we're resilient. And we will be there. And you know, the title of this report is a fear of losing everything. That hurts. That hurts right here. And yet we're going to walk forward. We're going to move forward. And, you know, we have the very basic right to continue to live on our traditional land, to harvest our traditional foods, to continue to be stewards of our lands for the well-being of all future generations. And that is never going to change. So Masi Cho, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that incredibly powerful and moving testimonial. And Sam, I think, has just stepped away from the camera briefly.
I think Elder Constance wanted to jump in before Sam starts anyway.
Yeah.
I wanted to say to Grandma Lorraine, Chimigwitch, for your good words, for your heart. And my heart aches for your people of the North, how you suffer. And that I think warmly of you, for that too is my homeland. My heart is there. And when I sit in front of my fire, I will bring the thoughts of you forward and hold that prayer for you. I thank you so much for the words you've brought to us today, Grandma. Chimigwitch.
Hey, Sam. do you want to take things from here and tell us a bit about climate change impacts in Peawanuck?
Wait. Okay, Sam Hunter from Peawanuck. I live on the south shore of Ontario's far north. We're on the 55th parallel north, 85 west. So we're about 18 miles from the shores of Hudson Bay up the Winnisk River. And I grew up out in the land. People call it trapline, but I call it my homeland. I'm now 55 years old, and what used to take thousands of years to transform in this subarctic landscape, I think that one of the things that I know when I was fairly young, maybe around 8, 9, 10 years old, we used to be able to cross the river. Everything would be frozen solid. It's like 40 years ago, 45 years ago. This was like, let's say November 7. We used to see around that time when it froze, but now it's like a month later. I don't think the spring has really changed that much, but it's the other side of the season that's really taken forever to get cold, like in December, November, December. It's like a month. And up in this country, we have what they call pausa or permafrost. And my homeland is at a place called Holly Lake, Sudden River. It's about 42 miles east of Peawanuck. Southeast, somewhere in that direction. But anyway, when my grandfather used to travel, I would say this would be like 70, 80 years ago, he would walk on the pausa. Pausa meaning permafrost, with the different, it's an environment where there's a lot of berries. There's a lichen for caribou, and we get wild tea from there, and we used to use it for storage for our food in the summertime. Dig a hole in the ground, and there's ice under there. It never a long time, but it's been melting really fast. And my grandfather used to travel to his campsite during the summer, so he's walking on solid ground because there's permafrost. But now a lot of that has melted. For sure, I can say 50% of it is gone till the next ice age, I guess. I don't know when that is, but it's all muskeg now, swampland. So you can't walk there anymore. You would sink in a swampland. We still have it a little bit along the coast and some places here and there. I work with the scientists studying permafrost, and what's happening with the melting permafrost, that it releases a gas called methane, and it's like times 20 times more greenhouse gases, therefore speeding up climate change. And this year, it's now January. We never had temperature past 30, I don't think. We had a couple of days was +4 just last week. And I think that these changes are happening too fast, that many people are not really prepared. So what's happening is that they go to the store. And because a lot of people live in poverty up here, they can only afford cheap food that's no good for their bodies, like cereal, white bread, milk, and then stuff like that, stuff that's cheap. That's all they can afford, and they start to get diabetes, and from diabetes, there's a chain reaction. They got mental health problems, and people are dying from diabetes. And this only started 4 to 5 years in our community, and it's getting worse. But I think that with climate change, there are other change reactions too, like out along the coast where we used to harvest ducks. We used to have thousands and thousands of ponds along the Hudson Bay. They're all gone now because of climate change. Ice is gone. The ponds dry up. And the fish runs that we used to have for a long time, as far as I can remember, the ones that run from July and August used to last 5 weeks. In the last few years, they only last 1 week. So a lot of people miss it. They have to be there at that time. And then it's been happening maybe about 5, 6 years now. And these are some of the changes. And also a few years ago, we had a fire. Made that fire went 68 miles from the Winnis River to a river called Aquatic. I think it's 68 miles approximately, give or take. And we used to have a lot of caribou in that area. Now they're gone, and they're hard to get. They moved south. We can't too far, and I don't know how long it's going to take for that lichen to grow. Lichen takes forever to grow. It all burned out, and anyway, these are some of the changes. And one of the things that I did not appreciate at that time was that the government did not want to put it out because more isolated, and their answer was, it's not worthwhile to put that fire out. But it affected us because of the our caribou that moved away. And one of the things that the elders said that about forest fires, that when the government came up here to talk with the people regarding the treaty, one of the things that they mentioned was putting out forest fires. They don't really do it unless if it's really close to the community. And they also promised us farm animals until 1929. Anyway, we never saw any one of those happening. And being from a fly-in community, everything that we have here is very expensive, and trying to adapt with these changes that are really unforeseen, because maybe 20 years ago we didn't have the experience, the expertise to predict what's happening. We're starting to now, and the changes that come along with the warming climate. Willows now, when I was young, willows used to be that high, 2 feet high at the most. Now they're like 8 feet tall. They're springing up all over the place, and we starting to see birch. We never had birch up here. Pelican, garter snakes, mountain lions, cormorant, stuff we never seen before, never existed up here. And that's just been happening in the last 10, 20 years. And on a positive note, we do have moose coming up here now, lots of moose. And the first moose we seen up here was about 100 years ago, 110 years ago. They're all over the place. And the people here, they want to learn how to cultivate some green produce, I guess. But they don't know how, they don't have the experience, but they want it, they know what they want. Because a piece of lettuce here is about $8 and they're usually very small. $8. And I remember buying a few down south, they were like $87 at Walmart. And that's a big difference. Eggs were like $8, $9 and bread is about the same. And all the good food that we need is very expensive. And the people that cannot hunt, they have to, when they want to eat meat, I think I remember seeing a piece of steak, I think it was $38 for one steak, a lot of money. And pork chop is the same, and bacon. It's very expensive. It's very hard for somebody to survive if they're living on old age pension or welfare. And sometimes that one of the things that really fail us is the government. When the Ford government, the PC government won a few years ago, we had it was cut overnight, but yet they want our resources without question, using the divide and conquer tactics with certain communities so they can have access to the minerals up here. Yet they don't want to pay for adaptation projects that we need so we can cultivate our own food and can them and preserve them. We can do it. We know it can be done, but we need the government to help us on the ground and not put something back to the people that live up here. It's really important to know that before you do anything up here, the lives of the people that live up here, that has to be considered first. You have to improve the quality of the life of the people that live up here. Other than that, that's all I can say at this time.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, so I think I'll just reflect back that what Sam and Lorraine both expressed, not only the devastating impacts that are being experienced, but also that their communities are actively taking steps and leading on the fight to address climate change. Sam, through his role as a monitor in his community, who has had to deal with the turbulence of the Ford government cutting his community's funding and then having to find alternative sources of funding to continue that important work. And as Lorraine highlighted, in Old Crow, her community launching these really innovative green energy projects, and one of the largest solar field projects in her community in Yukon. And unfortunately, the same ambition and proactive response has not been seen by the federal government or various provincial governments. And at the end of last year, the federal government released its new climate change plan, one that cemented essentially the same suite of existing policies and programs, with only a little bit of new steps to be taken, promised. It was rather a disappointing announcement after years and years of promises of bold climate change action. And on top of that, the continued absence of any real meaningful support to communities as they are entitled to, not only under, according to Canada's human rights obligations, but also as part of Canada's domestic legal obligations, whether that's treaty rights or Section 35 rights more broadly. And so I think, on that note, unless Sam and Lorraine have any other concluding thoughts they'd want to share, I'm happy to turn it over to questions for those of you who are so generously able to stay longer. I know we've run over time a bit.
No, we're supposed to go until 2, Rachel.
Oh, we are? Okay, awesome.
So we have time. So if folks have questions, please indicate that in the chat, and then I'll call on you. And while we wait for someone to be brave enough to ask their question, I have a question, or I guess a comment, and I'm so grateful to Sam and Lorraine for sharing, what this means to their community. It's different to read it in a report, and I hope that the law students feel that way as well, than to hear it from the mouths of someone from the community. And that's so meaningful and important for students to hear, because I know, lots of our law students have never been on a reserve, let alone to a flying community. And I hope that legal education continues to change so that more relationships are built between these big old colonial institutions and communities, so that students can build relationships with community members and come to respect our stories and our voices. Monica has a question. I mean, mine is more of a comment, and I don't know that it needs to be addressed directly right now, but I just wanted to pick up on what Lorraine said about, our hunters and our community members have been telling you this for 20 years. We've been talking about climate change for 20 years, and then you had to come in and verify it in your colonial way. And I wanted to kind of emphasize that for the law students, because eventually all of you are going to be in positions of power, be it with private firms or in the government, and just the ridiculousness of that is something that stood out amongst many powerful things that both of our speakers said. So with that, Monica, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So I'm not a law student. I'm actually a professor at the School of Business at Queen's, and I'm a marketing professor, and I actually research food insecurity and food access. And so your stories, unfortunately, they're not totally unusual, but they're very distressing all the same. And in Canada in particular, there's a lot of people in marketing who do research on food well-being and food insecurity and food access. But in Canada, I think we have a really unique situation compared to like in the US, where people may be looking at the impacts of just sort of rural food insecurity on rural communities, but you also have this deterioration of your cultural and traditional practices, and what does that mean for your cultural identity? How might we as settler researchers help you amplify your voices in broader communities? Because I think there's a lot of work being done in other disciplines, but not in business and not in marketing. And we do actually try and reach policymakers as well. So I'd be really interested in hearing how we could participate, obviously within all the TCPS and all of those guidelines as well, to try and work with you to help bring your voices to a broader reach. And I guess either Sammy or Lorraine, if you have any thoughts, and Rachel as well, you were nodding, so maybe you have some thoughts as well.
I do have a thought, but I'll leave it to Sam and Lorraine to answer first.
Can I go first?
Please, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate this question, because recently we started getting scientists to help us, and building that relationship. I took a lot of harsh words from myself, because I want to tell you something that's not funny or happy or whatever you want to call it. And growing up out in the country, the government, who we call Ministry of Natural Resources now, they used to be called Lands and Forests, and they would come to our camp and they told us, you cannot build any houses here, we will burn them down. They said that a couple of times. We started building relationships with the government. I reminded them of that in a crowd of maybe 400 people. And since then, they came to the community help research, also taking our traditional ecological knowledge. And a lot of it goes hand in hand. And I think that when we established this relationship, it went on very good. They supplied us with equipment and helicopters and teaching us how to network with universities involved with the project. And then COVID happened, everything just collapsed. Unfortunately, the relationship that we established on us, and I don't know what's going to happen from here, because the people that we were working with, they've been reassigned. The Ford government dismantled MNRF. It took some responsibilities away and gave some to Ministry of Environment. And so the structure that we started out with kind of like collapsed, and that's what happened with that. And I don't know what's going to happen from here.
Lorraine, do you have anything you want to add?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam, for your comments. I appreciate it, and a lot of similarities in our communities. He's in Northern Ontario, I believe, and I'm in North Yukon. And yes, thank you so much for your question. You know, you as law students in the University of Toronto, you know, you have your respective homes. You live in Toronto, and you're learning your profession. And what we can do is be partners with each other. You're going to have a very responsible role, not only in your profession, but as a Canadian citizen. We're all Canadians, and we live in this wonderful country of Canada. And we can make a difference. And that's what I do. I advocate to people like you. I help build understanding of what our issues are. And I look to you to help build that change for your world and the future generations of all of our people that's going to be left with this mess. And so the more that we understand each other, the stronger our relationship is, then we might have some hope. And, you know, my brothers and sisters, First Nations people from all across this country are advocating. We sit at tables, we build that understanding and relationship so that people will understand who we are and what our needs are. And so part of that, you know, climate change is not new. This dialogue has been going on for the last 40 years. And so, excuse me, what's really important is looking at solutions. What are the solutions moving forward? You know, Canadian government, this government, at least they've acknowledged that there is climate change. Thank God for that. And what they've also acknowledged is that the relationship with with Indigenous people in Canada is important. And what they're trying to do is to acknowledge that there are issues in our regions, but that's still in the talking phase. And for us in my community, we are a self-governing First Nation. So we manage our own affairs and our own governance in our little community, not even 300 people. So we have that freedom to protect our lands and our resources in that way, and we have. And you know, and thanks to the vision of our elders and our leaders of our past and our leaders of today. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you're out and about in your daily work and in your daily talking with your family and your friends, education is the key. Education is the key, because what I found over time is that it seems like the North is not even part of Canada. It's like we're a foreign place. So we are part of Canada. And we are taking a leadership role, but we definitely need policy changes. We definitely need all of our federal ministers and government workers to know that climate change is real, that their policies and their programs is ancient and need change. And that, when we're talking about permafrost melting, they got to think about how in my community are we going to build a proper home structure for one of our elders without falling and going to the wayside. And we need to have options open on how we move forward to adapt to all these changes and the funding to go with that. We need to, like I mentioned earlier, we're a resilient people. And we're moving forward in resilience. But, when you're talking about supporting business, we have a small business opportunities in my community. And those businesses cater to the needs of our people. We had one company that was there that was running our local food store. We asked them to leave. They weren't providing us fresh foods so that our children can be healthy. You walk into the store, all you see is mountain of pop and chips and whatever. So we took the responsibility and say, okay, you're not providing what we need. And now we do have fresh fruits and vegetables, and at the same prices as Sam was mentioning for meat. And so it's we face many challenges as we move forward with climate change, and yet we are looking at what our solutions are. So we need you as the messenger to help walk with us in this way. Thank you.
Masi Cho, Lorraine. We have actually a law student from Thunder Bay, from Lakehead University, who's going to ask our next question, which I think Sam has actually already provided a preamble to. And I love that Lorraine pointed out that folks don't seem to know the North folks in Toronto don't seem to know that the North exists. And, you know, from the perspective of some Torontonians, Muskoka is the North and Lakehead is the far, far North. So thanks for bringing that into the conversation. And Erin, please take it away.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Rachel, Lorraine, and Sam for your words today. I am curious if anyone could expand a little bit on how the COVID-19 pandemic has further impacted Indigenous communities' access to food. Yeah, that's what I'd like to know. Thanks.
Hello.
Okay, who's gonna go first? Lorraine, you go.
Okay, I can go first. What I'd like to say to that is for us in our remote community, a remote isolated community, the pressure was 10 times more than what it even was down here in Whitehorse or in other cities. Because we live in a small isolated community. If we happen to have one case of COVID in my community, that would have been it. So I'm really grateful and happy to say that our leadership took extreme measures right from the get-go to protect our community and not allowing people to fly into our community unless it was absolutely necessary, and the same for us as community to fly out. And the pandemic has definitely affected us in all ways, in all areas of our life, mentally, emotionally, physically, and in all areas. But also, having said that, on the other hand, and on the other side of that, you know, our community work really have a strong relationship with all levels of government. And so what we've done is made sure that our families had the means to go out on the land. So it strengthened that relationship again with family ties and families going out on the land and being out there and trying to be healthier, but really protecting our elders and our most vulnerable. And you know, we're isolated enough as it is. And again, you know, from different perspectives, you could look at this as a negative or you could build it into a positive. But it was a very, very scary time for all of us. And we continue to hold, you know, all our Indigenous communities across Canada in prayer, because I know they're dealing with large numbers across the communities. And right now we're next week, the community is going to have the vaccine, the shots is coming to our community. But the pandemic definitely played a major role this whole year. And what we try to do as a community is really be prepared for it. We had an emergency team, an emergency response team set up and all that. So we did our best and we continue to do our best and really take the measures, you know, the restrict, the safe six, they call it. We took that very seriously. Thank you.
Sam, over to you.
Hi. Are you ready? I think that with our community, we did see a lot of impacts. I think 5-6 months after COVID started last year, the store ran out of supplies, food, and it was like that for maybe 2 months, and it started to get shape with the stock at the store. And I think that it was really noticeable at that time because people complained and they didn't have this, they didn't have that. And but now it seems like things are back to normal, but I noticed that things are really expensive. I was talking to a friend yesterday. He said a little bag of grapes are $30. I think like the fruits and vegetables, they really doubled in price. So I'm not sure if that has to do with COVID. Maybe it does. I never did research that, but I think that that was a good question because it made me think about the very expensive here. So other than that, things are back to normal, and but I think some items are more expensive than they were. Thank you.
Marcy, so thank you all so much. I'm mindful of the time, so we're coming up on 2 o'clock, and we want to have time to ask Elder Constance to close our event in a good way. I just wanted to quickly thank our speakers. You know, I've had a lot of emotions in learning more about this, and I'm really grateful to all of you for sharing. And you know, it's difficult for me to hear it, and I can't imagine how difficult it is for you to talk about this and what's happening in your community. So thank you for your selflessness and your generosity with the law students, and I know that it'll have an impact on the way that they go about their law school experience and the way that they practice law as well. I wanted to thank Human Rights Watch more generally for the important work that they do, and all of Human Rights Watch's supporters, and the Law Foundation of Ontario, who supports the Indigenous Initiatives Office work at U of T. So I'm sure I am forgetting people. I'm really grateful to Robin from Lakehead for bringing his students here and for coming. Thank you all so much. We have another event coming up on Friday, which is an introduction to the duty to consult. And section 35. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, you can send me an email and I can send you the registration link for that. It's a great week for Indigenous issues at U of T. So Elder Constance, I'm gonna hand it over to you, unless Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to say? Oh, you're on mute, Rachel.
I think only just to say that now is a great time to be calling your government representatives and telling them that you know, both climate change action and support for First Nations to adapt to the impacts of climate change that they're already experiencing is an issue that you care about and hope to see you know, raised in government and concrete steps taken. We've seen some kind of, you know, superficial acknowledgements, including in the throne speech late last year, that this is something that, you know, that government is aware of and plans to address. But of course, you know, promises in this context are empty until, you know, given meaning. So you know, please do make the effort to, you know, as Sam and Lorraine said, like, you know, share this in your communities, in your families, in your networks, and to the extent that you're able, raise it with your representatives.
Thank you, Rachel. That's so important. I'm so sorry to rush that at the end too. And we have the email addresses for everyone who registered. So while we will not spam you, because that would be against the anti-spam legislation, we will send out the link to the video once it's back online that that Human Rights Watch put together that features Sam and some of his community, because it's a really powerful and visually stunning look at the way that climate change is impacting his community. And if there are any advocacy pieces that folks can follow up on, we'll send those out as well via email. So I'm going to stop the recording there and hand it back over to Elder Constance.
So thank you, Amanda, and thank you to